When Claire married David, she thought life was finally giving her a second chance. She was 34, steady in her job as an interior designer in Seattle, and ready to build something lasting. David was kind, dependable, and had a calm strength that drew her in. The only thing she wasn't sure about was his son Ethan, a 16-year-old boy who had lost his mother 2 years earlier. She'd seen a picture of him at their wedding, a handsome boy with dark hair, intelligent eyes, and a sadness that made him look older than his age. Claire had promised herself she would be patient, that she would never try to replace his mother. She only wanted to make the house feel like a home again. But after the wedding, the house on Cedar Lane didn't feel like a home. It felt quiet, too quiet. David's work as an engineer kept him traveling most of the week. When he was gone, it was just Claire and Ethan. He was polite but distant, careful in every word he spoke. He'd say good morning and thank you when she cooked, but his eyes stayed down. He'd eat fast, excuse himself, and disappear into his room or the garage. Sometimes she heard faint sounds music, a low hum, but when she got close, it's always stopped. Claire tried to reach out. She made pancakes the way David said Ethan liked them, with chocolate chips shaped like smiley faces. She asked about school, his friends, his classes. He answered with short sentences that led nowhere. She decorated the living room with warm lights and soft colors, hoping to bring some life into the space that still held photos of David's late wife. Claire never touched those pictures. She didn't want to erase the past. She only wanted to add a little warmth to it. One Thursday evening, rain began to fall hard against the windows. Claire came home early from work, carrying grocery bags and humming softly to herself. The house was dim, the lights off except for a faint glow under Ethan's door. She assumed he was studying, so she unpacked quietly. Then, as she walked past the hallway leading to the garage, she heard something faint, a sound that stopped her in her tracks. It was music, soft, uncertain, but beautiful. A guitar string plucked gently, then a voice young, deep, trembling, yet full of emotion. Claire frowned, listening. The voice was singing something slow, almost like a lullaby. She followed the sound, careful not to make a noise. The garage door was half closed, light slipping through the crack. She peeked inside. Ethan was sitting on an old stool, his head slightly bowed, eyes closed, guitar in hand. The sound filled the space, echoing off the concrete walls. He wasn't just playing, he was feeling. Every word that came out of his mouth carried pain, longing, and a tenderness that stopped her heart. She didn't know what the song was about, but she could tell it came from deep inside him. He looked like a boy trying to talk to someone who wasn't there anymore. Maybe his mother. Maybe life itself. Claire froze in the doorway. She didn't want him to see her. She didn't want to break that fragile moment. The light from the single bulb above him made the scene look almost sacred. For the first time since moving in, she saw who Ethan really was, not the quiet teenager who avoided her, but a young man who carried a world of pain he didn't know how to share. When the song ended, he sighed, lowered his guitar, and sat in silence. Claire quietly stepped back, her heart still racing. She closed the door before he could notice. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing his voice in her mind, so full of truth and loneliness. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking of all the times she'd tried to make conversation and failed. Maybe words weren't what he needed. Maybe he just needed someone to listen, to understand. The next morning, Claire made breakfast as usual. The smell of coffee and toast filled the kitchen. Ethan came down the stairs, his hair messy, backpack slung over one shoulder. She smiled, trying to act casual. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he muttered. Sitting at the counter, she wanted to tell him she'd heard him sing. She wanted to say how beautiful it was, but she also knew he might shut down if she said too much. After a moment of silence, she picked up a small sticky note from the counter and wrote something quickly. When Ethan finished eating and went upstairs to grab his things, she slipped the note next to his guitar case by the door. Then she left for work. All day. She wondered if he'd seen it. When she came home that evening, the house was quiet again. But as she put her purse down, she noticed something different. The garage door wasn't closed. It was open. Music drifted softly into the house once more. Claire smiled, heart lifting. She walked slowly toward the sound, just enough to see without intruding. Ethan was there again, guitar on his lap, a little more confident this time. And on the stool beside him, she saw her note creased and open. It said only a few words. "You have a beautiful voice. Don't hide it." Ethan glanced at the doorway for a brief second. And for the first time since she'd known him, he didn't look away immediately. His lips curved into a faint, unsure smile. He nodded slightly, as if to say thank you. It was the smallest moment, but it changed something. The silence between them no longer felt cold. It felt like space waiting to be filled. That night, Claire sat by the window watching the rain fall again. But this time the sound didn't feel lonely. Somewhere in the house, she knew there was music. For the first time in months. She felt hope, gentle, fragile hope that maybe they weren't strangers anymore. Maybe slowly they could start to become something like a family. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of a story neither of them had expected, a story about healing, about finding connection in the quiet, and about how love sometimes begins not with words, but with the sound of a song in an empty garage. The next morning, the air in the house felt different, lighter somehow. Claire noticed it the moment she came downstairs. The breakfast table was quiet as usual, but when Ethan walked in, there was a small, polite morning that didn't sound forced. He looked a little shy, almost as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Claire didn't push. She smiled and poured him orange juice. He left for school, and she stood by the window watching him walk away, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in months. That evening when she returned home, she heard it again, the sound of a guitar. It came from the garage, soft and hesitant, like someone trying to rebuild courage. Claire hesitated at the door, unsure if she should go in. But something told her to take the chance. She opened the door gently, and this time Ethan didn't stop playing. He looked up, met her eyes briefly, and kept going. His fingers moved slowly over the strings, and his voice carried a raw, unpolished beauty. "Sorry," he muttered when the song ended, setting the guitar aside. "Don't be," Claire said softly, stepping closer. "It's really beautiful. Did you write that song?" He nodded, a little embarrassed. "Yeah. My mom used to sing it with me." For a second, neither of them spoke. The garage felt still, filled with something heavy but gentle grief that hadn't found words until now. Claire swallowed, her heart aching for him. "She must have been very proud of you." Ethan shrugged. "She liked to sing. I just never stopped." That small confession opened a door between them. From that night on, things began to change, not in big, dramatic ways, but in quiet ones. Claire started spending time in the garage with him after work. She didn't talk much. She just sat on a stool, sipping tea while Ethan played. Sometimes he'd hum. Sometimes he'd ask what she thought of a verse or a melody. And every time, she gave honest, gentle answers. She learned that he wrote songs about everything, about the rain, about school, about his mother. Some were unfinished, just fragments of melodies that drifted into silence. Claire admired his talent. He didn't try to sound perfect. He just wanted to feel something real. One evening, she brought her laptop to the garage. "What if we record one of your songs?" she asked. Ethan looked surprised. "Record it? Like, for real?" "Sure," she said. "David's birthday is coming up next month. You could make it a gift." He hesitated. "I don't know if he'd even like it." Claire smiled. "He'll love it. Trust me." So they started working together. After dinner, the garage turned into their little studio. Claire learned how to hold the mic, how to hit the record button, how to fix the echo by putting up blankets on the walls. They laughed when the dog next door barked in the middle of a take. They started talking more, not just about music, but about small things. Claire told him about her first apartment, her favorite songs from the 90s, her fear of thunderstorms. Ethan told her about his favorite bands, his old friends in Portland, how he missed his mom's pancakes. The walls around him began to fall, one by one. Still, there were moments when he pulled back, days when he came home from school, quiet and withdrawn. Claire didn't push. She had learned to give him space. But one evening, she heard him arguing with someone on the phone. She couldn't hear the words, only the tone frustrated hurt. When he came into the kitchen later, his eyes were red. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. He shrugged. "Just some people from school." She nodded, not wanting to pry. "Want to play for a bit?" Music helps sometimes. He hesitated, then gave a half smile. "Yeah, maybe." They went to the garage and he picked up his guitar. This time this song was new, sad but hopeful. When he finished, Claire clapped softly. "That one's special," she said. "What's it called?" He looked down. "Haven't named it yet?" She smiled. "Maybe you should call it Starting Over." He liked that. For the first time, she saw him laugh, a real, unguarded laugh that made his whole face light up. It was small, but it felt like a sunrise breaking through the clouds that had followed him for years. Days turned into weeks. Their recording project became a routine. David called every few nights from work trips, happy to hear that things at home were going well, though he had no idea about the secret song waiting for him. The connection between Claire and Ethan deepened quietly. It wasn't mother and son, not exactly, but it was something real, something built on trust, patience, and the soft rhythm of shared silence. One weekend afternoon, Ethan surprised her. "Hey, Claire," he said, appearing at her office door. "Do you want to help me with the lyrics?" She looked up from her sketchbook. "Me? I don't know if I'm any good at that," he shrugged. "You always know what feels right." "That's kind of the same thing." She smiled and followed him to the garage. He handed her a notebook filled with half-finished lines. They spent hours scribbling ideas, crossing out words, laughing over bad rhymes. Claire noticed how natural it felt, how easy. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about how to connect with him. She already had, as they worked. She glanced around the garage. There were paint cans, boxes of old tools, and now, because of him, music sheets pinned to the wall. It no longer looked like a cold space for storage. It looked like life was being lived there again. When they finally finished the song, Ethan leaned back, smiling. "I think it's ready. It's perfect," Claire said softly. That night, they recorded it. His voice trembled at first, but when he sang the chorus, it came out strong and full of emotion. Claire watched him, proud and moved. The boy who once hid behind silence was now filling the house with something beautiful. After they saved the recording, Ethan looked at her. "Thanks for believing in me," he said quietly. "You did all the work," she replied. "I just listened." He smiled again, small but sincere. "Still, it means a lot." When Claire went to bed that night, she felt something she hadn't felt since marrying David: peace. Not the quiet kind that comes from being alone, but the warm kind that comes from knowing you've finally reached someone's heart. Outside, rain began to fall again, steady and soft. Downstairs, the faint sound of Ethan's guitar drifted through the house, blending with the rain. Claire closed her eyes and listened. The silence that once filled the house was gone, replaced by music. Laughter, and the fragile beginning of something whole again, and deep inside. She knew this was only the start of Ethan's healing. And maybe hers too. Autumn came quietly to Seattle. The trees along Cedar Lane turned golden, and the air smelled like rain and fallen leaves. Life in the house finally felt warm again. Ethan still had his quiet moods, but he laughed more now. Sometimes Claire caught him humming while doing homework or tapping his pencil in rhythm. The walls that once echoed with silence now carried the sound of music and small talk. The song they recorded for David's birthday had been a success. David was speechless when Ethan played it for him one evening after dinner. He just sat there smiling through tears and said, "That's the best gift I've ever had." For the first time in years, Ethan let his father hug him without pulling away. Claire watched them, heart full, knowing that moment meant more than words could describe. After that, life felt easier. The tension that had lingered between Ethan and Claire faded into something like friendship. They teased each other about messy rooms, burned pancakes, and the dog next door who barked every morning at 6. Yet, even in the calm, there was something Claire couldn't quite name, a quiet sadness in Ethan's eyes that sometimes appeared when he thought no one was looking. She sensed he still carried a part of his mother's memory, like a secret weight. One Sunday afternoon, Claire decided to clean the attic. It was a cold, rainy day, and Ethan was at a friend's house. David was away on another work trip, so the house was still except for the sound of rain on the roof. Claire climbed up the narrow stairs with a flashlight and a basket for storage. The attic was full of boxes labeled memories, winter clothes, and Julia's things. She hesitated at the last one. She hadn't opened any of Julia's boxes before. She'd always felt it wasn't her place. But as she looked around, she noticed some of them were covered in dust, untouched for years. Something inside her whispered that maybe it was time for these memories to breathe again. She knelt and opened the box carefully. Inside were old photo albums, notebooks, and a few framed pictures. One of them was of Julia holding a baby Ethan as a toddler. Grinning wide, his tiny hand clutching her hair. Claire smiled softly. Julia looked kind, gentle. No wonder Ethan missed her so deeply. As she continued sorting, a small envelope slipped from between two photo albums and fluttered to the floor. It was yellowed with age, sealed, and had faint handwriting on the front. "For Ethan, when you're ready." Claire froze. Her breath caught. The ink was faded, but the message was clear. Julia had written this for her son. She turned the envelope over in her hands, her heart pounding. Should she open it? No, this wasn't hers to read. But should she leave it here, hidden under boxes of old memories? Something about those words, "when you're ready," felt like a call. Maybe Ethan had never seen it. Maybe he was ready now. She placed it carefully in her pocket, closed the boxes, and climbed down from the attic. For hours, she sat in the living room, staring at the envelope on the coffee table. She imagined Julia writing it, maybe during her illness, maybe when she knew she wouldn't be around much longer. The thought made her chest tighten. When Ethan came home that evening, the smell of wet leaves followed him through the door. He was in good spirits, joking about how his friend's dog had stolen his sandwich. Claire smiled but said nothing at first. She waited until he dropped his bag and sat down. "Ethan," she said softly, holding up the envelope. "I found something today while cleaning the attic. It's for you." He looked puzzled. "For me?" She nodded. "It's from your mom." The words seemed to freeze him. His face went pale, his eyes wide. He reached for the envelope with shaking hands, staring at the familiar handwriting. "You found this?" "Yes," Claire said quietly. "I think she wanted you to have it." For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. He just stared at it as if afraid that opening it would make something real against something he wasn't ready to face. Finally, he whispered, "Can I read it here?" "Of course," Claire said. He broke the seal carefully. The paper inside was folded neatly with small, graceful handwriting. He read silently at first, his lips moving faintly. Then his eyes filled with tears. Claire stayed still, giving him space. After a minute, he spoke, his voice breaking. "She wrote this before she got sick. She said she wanted me to keep singing. That music would help me remember her, but also move on. She said she knew Dad would be okay, but she worried about me." He wiped his eyes, his voice trembling. "She said she loved me more than the sky loves the stars." Claire felt tears in her own eyes. "She sounds like she really knew your heart." Ethan nodded, holding the letter close. For the first time, he didn't hide his tears. Claire moved closer, not saying anything, just resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. He leaned into her, his body shaking as years of bottled grief came pouring out. She held him silent, steady, the way a mother would not to replace what was lost, but to remind him that love could still be found. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to talk about her again. But reading this, it feels like she's still here, telling me it's okay to live again." Claire smiled softly. "She is still here, Ethan. Every time you sing, every time you remember her, she's right there with you." He looked at her then, eyes red but clear. "Thank you for finding this." "I think she wanted you to have it now," Claire said. "You were ready." He nodded, clutching the letter as if it were gold. That night, he didn't go straight to bed. He went to the garage. Claire heard the familiar sound of the guitar again, but this time the melody was different, lighter, hopeful. She stood by the kitchen window, listening, tears slipping down her cheeks. The next morning, Ethan placed the letter in a frame on his desk. "So I don't forget," he said simply. Claire smiled and helped him find a spot for it beside a photo of Julia. The sun broke through the clouds, filling his room with light. From that day on, something changed in Ethan. He was still quiet at times, but the sadness no longer ruled him. He talked about his mom openly, sometimes even laughed at old memories. He started writing more songs about love, loss, and healing. Claire could hear them through the walls. And every note told her the same thing. He was finally finding peace. In the evenings, when David came home, the three of them sometimes sat in the living room, talking or listening to music. There was laughter, warmth, and an unspoken understanding that this was what family was meant to feel like, not perfect, but real. And when Claire looked at Ethan across the room, strumming softly on his guitar, she knew she'd never forget the moment she handed him that envelope, the moment everything quietly began to change. Winter came early that year, brushing the streets of Seattle with frost and long gray mornings. The days grew shorter, but the house on Cedar Lane felt brighter than ever. The warmth inside didn't come from the heater, came from music, laughter, and something that finally felt like home. Ethan was different now. He smiled more, spoke freely, and carried his guitar everywhere. It was as if the letter from his mother had lifted a weight off his heart. Claire noticed it in the little things. How he'd hum while washing dishes, how he'd stop to help her carry groceries, how he'd ask about her day. The boy who once hid behind silence had learned to let the world in again. David, too, was happier. He couldn't stop talking about how proud he was of his son. Sometimes after dinner, the three of them would sit together and Ethan would play the songs he'd been working on. His voice had grown stronger, more confident, filled with quiet emotion that could move anyone listening. One night in December, Claire came home to find Ethan waiting in the living room, guitar in hand, his face lit with excitement. "Claire," he said quickly, "do you remember that cafe downtown, the one with open mic nights?" "Yeah," she said. "The Maple Room, right?" He nodded. "I signed up. I'm performing there this Friday." Claire froze, eyes wide. "You're really doing it?" "Yeah," he said, smiling nervously. "I think I'm ready." She smiled, her chest tight with pride. "I'll be there. Front row." The week passed quickly. Every evening, Ethan practiced in the garage. Claire helped him pick an outfit, nothing fancy, just a simple denim jacket and a black shirt. She even helped him print flyers for his performance, though he laughed and said, "It's just a small place, Claire, not a concert." Still, she knew it meant more than that. It wasn't just a performance, it was a beginning. Friday night came cold and clear. The cafe was cozy and full of people, the air thick with the smell of coffee and cinnamon. Fairy lights hung across the stage and soft chatter filled the room. Claire and David sat in the front row, holding hands. When Ethan's name was called, he stepped up to the microphone, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted the strap on his guitar. "Hi," he said, voice a little shaky. "I'm Ethan. This song is called 'The Light You Left.' It's about remembering the people who never really leave us." The room went silent. He began to play. The first notes were soft, almost like a whisper. His voice carried through the cafe, clear, warm, and honest. The lyrics told the story of loss and love, of learning to breathe again after heartbreak. It wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about healing, about the people who help us find our way back to life. "You're the light I see in the morning rain, the echo that whispers my name. You left, but somehow you stayed, in the songs that I still play." Claire felt tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. She looked at David. His eyes were glassy too. Around them, the room was silent, except for Ethan's voice and the soft hum of his guitar. It was raw, real, and beautiful. When he finished, there was a heartbeat of quiet before the crowd erupted into applause. People stood, clapping, cheering. Ethan looked stunned, smiling wide, his eyes shining under the warm lights. Claire stood too, clapping until her hands stung. David shouted, "That's my son," and everyone laughed. Ethan bowed awkwardly, then stepped off the stage, his face red with joy and disbelief. After the show, the cafe owner came up to him. "You've got something special, kid," she said. "If you ever want to perform again, our stage is open." Ethan grinned, thanking her, his voice full of excitement. As they walked out into the cool night air, he turned to Claire and David. "I can't believe that just happened." Claire smiled. "Believe it. You were amazing." David put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Your mom would be so proud." Ethan looked down for a moment, his smile softening. "I think she was there tonight," he said quietly. "I could feel it." They drove home with the windows slightly fogged and the radio playing low. The city lights flickered past, and Claire sat in the passenger seat, watching Ethan in the rearview mirror. He looked peaceful, lighter than she had ever seen him that night. After David went to bed, Claire found Ethan still awake in the kitchen, sipping cocoa. He looked up when she walked in. "Couldn't sleep," he said with a small grin. "I don't blame you," she said, sitting across from him. "Big night." He nodded. "You know, I didn't think I'd ever have the courage to sing in front of people again. When Mom died, I stopped believing in music. But then you came along, and somehow it didn't feel so scary anymore." Claire's throat tightened. "Ethan, I didn't do much." "Yes, you did," he said firmly. "You listened. You made space for me. That's more than most people do." She smiled through her tears. "You make it easy to care." He looked down at his mug, then back up. "Thank you, Claire, for everything." She reached out, touching his hand gently. "You don't have to thank me. Just keep singing. That's thanks enough." He nodded, smiling, and for a long moment, they just sat there in quiet understanding. Over the next few months, Ethan kept performing. Every Friday night, he played at the Maple Room, and sometimes people came just to hear him sing. Word spread. He started writing new songs, songs about hope, new beginnings, and second chances. One of them was called The Quiet House, written for Claire. It began with the line, "Once there was silence, now there's a song." The first time she heard it, she cried again. Not because it was sad, but because it captured everything: the loneliness they'd shared, the healing they'd found, and the love that had quietly grown between them. By spring, the house on Cedar Lane was alive with music. Ethan's laughter echoed through the halls. David's voice joined in sometimes. Claire would hum along while cooking dinner. The silence that had once haunted the home was gone forever. One evening, as the sun set in soft pink and gold, Ethan played on the porch while Claire watched from the steps. The melody drifted into the cool air, calm and full of life. When he finished, he looked at her and smiled. "You know," he said, "I think this is what Mom meant in her letter music, bringing me back to life." Claire smiled back, her heart full. "And it did. For both of us." T laughed softly. "Yeah, I guess we both started over." As twilight settled around them, the sound of his guitar filled the night one last time. It wasn't a song of sadness anymore. It was a song of love, healing, and the quiet kind of happiness that comes when broken hearts finally find their rhythm again. And in that moment, Claire knew this was more than just a story about grief or family. It was about how love, in its gentlest form, could rebuild a life note by note until even silence began to sing.